Good evening, this is News.PH, but it's not politics as usual. I'm Pia Hontiveros. Earlier today, the National Economic Development Authority presented the RAY plan, the reconstruction assistance on Yolanda before foreign countries represented by their ambassadors, multilateral organizations and aid groups, and non-government organizations and the private sector. Our guests tonight, Assistant Secretary Jesus Domingo of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Deputy Director General Emmanuel Esguerra of NEDA, Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator Chris Kay of the United Nations, and Deputy Director General Ramesh Subramaniam, is that correct, of the Asian Development Bank. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here. Let's begin with DFA ASEC Domingo and NEDA Deputy Director General Esguerra. You were the hosts of the event this morning, correct?
Yes,
in a way.
Yes.
But it was NEDA that presented the plan, that did the plan, that made the plan. Is that correct, sir?
Well, we led the team that it was an interagency effort, and NEDAC did the coordination.
Yeah, okay. So interagency effort, like what government agencies were
All
involved?
government agencies were practically involved in coming up with the assessments of damage and losses.
Mm-hmm. When did you start that? Making that assessment?
About 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago?
3 weeks ago.
Okay. And it took you, okay, so 3 weeks now. So you did a briefing this morning. You were briefing, is that correct, what I said? You have all the foreign countries there, multilateral organization, aid agencies?
Yes.
Yeah. And the purpose was?
Well, the purpose was to present the RAY plan and give the development partners an overview of the damage and losses, as well as the reconstruction needs and the investment requirements that would be needed in order to put the Central Philippines or the Visayas region back on its feet.
Investment requirements, so it was a pledging session.
Well, not exactly,
Not exactly, but
some development partners did express commitments in terms of dollars and euros.
Okay. This, what you presented was a blueprint.
Yes.
Would you call it a blueprint?
It is a plan that shows what are the priorities for the immediate term. Immediate term, we mean at the present time until about the first quarter of 2014, and then beyond that for the rest of 2014, and then for the medium to long term, which is 2015 and beyond.
Okay, damage and losses you estimated at over 570 billion.
Yes, and we would like to emphasize though that that is not a hard and fast figure, in the sense that that is our estimate based on the best available information at the time. And we are sure that when the sector teams go to the field some more to validate, many of those figures might still change depending on the severity of the impact that we see in the
might
field.
still change, meaning baka tumaas pa.
Could go
it might
higher,
even
yes.
it will go higher. Okay. And then you say that we need about 361 billion pesos. Correct? So that means that
for recovery and reconstruction.
For recovery and reconstruction.
Yes.
So that means this might even go higher also.
Yes.
Okay. When you say 361 billion, and you said there were like, you want to give an idea of what investments needed. There were, like you said, there were some pledges or commitments made. Can you be more specific?
Okay. Well, the commitments came by way of the various development partners expressing some kind of a focus for their assistance. For example, the Embassy of Japan said that they would be interested to assist in the area of public infrastructure, in terms of repairing the LGU facilities, and some assistance for human development, in particular health, sanitation, and education. United Kingdom, for example, ask about the possibility of being involved in projects that can be done on the basis of a public-private partnership. The World Bank, for example, the World Bank has already been involved in providing technical assistance for the damage and loss assessments, together with ADB is also already committed some amounts.
Okay, let me ask first DFA ASEC Domingo, exactly what is the DFA's role here?
Well, generally, the Department of Foreign Affairs is the first line of contact with the outside world, with our bilateral friends, with international organizations. And from the start of the Yolanda crisis, we activated the Yolanda Action Center, where we coordinated immediate relief assistance offered by foreign countries, NGOs, international institutions. And now that the emergency and relief phase is over, we're supporting the cabinet team in RAY. The specific role of the DFA is that we are a member of the cabinet working group on resource generation and allocation, together with NEDA, Department of Finance, and Department of Budget. And one of our activities has been also is to backstop the RAY process, and the event of the launch of RAY was held at the Department of Foreign Affairs this morning, which we co-chaired with the Department of Finance, but of course the main feature was the presentation of RAY by NEDA.
Yeah, okay. Ray says that in the latter pages that it is Secretary Ping Lacson, as presidential assistant, who will be in charge. Is that correct?
On the implementation.
On the implementation,
yes.
yeah. Because sometimes we have a problem when it comes to the Philippine government. When you have too many people. Well, not naman, hindi naman spoiling the broth right away, but so it will be Secretary Lacson.
Yes,
in charge.
The president has announced that he is the one in charge of overseeing the implementation of the rehabilitation.
Okay. Deputy Director General, I was kind of curious also about the report, because it's a 21-page report, at least the one I got, no? And apparently it's only the last 4 pages where you have the actual blueprint or the plan, because the first 17 pages, it's all about the loss and the damages, right? And then when you look at page 18, you start off with like core principles, for example. I was looking for something a little bit more specific, or am I asking for too much?
Well, the actual implementation will need to be fleshed out. But just to give you a general idea, the categories that you see in the tables, like infrastructure, economic sector, social sector, cross-sectoral, at the operational level, the implementation will be guided by that. So the agencies, for example, that are involved in infrastructure, for example, DPWH will be leading the infrastructure component. And then the various agencies involved in the economic sectors, DTI, Department of Agriculture, they will be primarily involved in that particular component. So the coordination and the implementation will be carried out by the specific agencies.
Okay, coordination. Again, let's just go back very briefly to. So you have Secretary Ping Lacson there, but you have all these different government agencies now, and the problem really is when you have so many government agencies all working together. How are we going to make sure that you are going to work well together and that this plan will really get off the ground? Because the disaster after Yolanda could turn out to be a very minor disaster if this rehabilitation plan is mishandled, right?
Yes.
Well, if I may, I think with our many disasters over the years, I think we've been getting better at it. And the role of a czar for reconstruction recovery, there is a precedent for it. The cabinet secretary, Mr. Almendras, for example, was appointed as the rehabilitation czar after Pablo, and we're supporting him in that, and he's doing a good job there.
But we haven't fully recovered from Pablo, right?
Not yet, but I mean, at least he was. Well, my point being that he was identified as a coordinator for. So I think we are in government. We're getting better at working with each other and as a team for reconstruction and recovery. I think another interesting thing to note is we also tapped the experience of Indonesia. As you know, they were also devastated by the Indian Ocean tsunami in Aceh. So the architect, Minister Kuntoro, came to the Philippines last week and shared his experiences with us. And I think much of what he said is also, I think, of relevance here. And I think there's a parallel situation that you really need to have a czar, a strong personality who enjoys the confidence of the cabinet and the president.
And the people, don't
and
forget,
the people, of course,
most importantly.
Yes, of course, yes.
Okay. Let's speak now to Chris Cave, the UN, and our representative here from the ADB. What did you think of RAY, of the RAY plan?
Well, we're very excited and very comfortable with the RAY plan, to be honest. I mean, this is something which wasn't a surprise to us. We've been working very closely with many of the line ministries, ensuring that the assistance that comes in through the United Nations family, the NGOs, are very much tied up with the priorities that are identified, particularly using a cluster approach across the various social sectors, particularly whether it's in education or in health. Water and sanitation and so on and so forth. So a lot of what is included in inference, included in the RAY, particularly at the front end, is very much in keeping and is detailed, in fact, in our own plans and work with the line ministries.
Explain more the cluster approach. You know, not very many people are familiar with it.
No, okay.
But it worked very well. It's working very well, right?
Indeed, yes. You know, there's a variety of different areas of work which are really crucial in the immediate aftermath of emergency. And of course, food is one of them. But you can't talk about food in isolation of understanding food security more broadly and ensuring that everything that you do also helps to restore livelihoods, and particularly in the agriculture sector. So, you know, we've brought a variety of different organizations to work in food and agriculture together.
That's one cluster.
As a particular cluster, exactly.
Okay.
And there's similar examples all the way down the line, whether it's in...
It's okay, go ahead, name, we have an hour. Go ahead and name all those clusters. No, this is going to be really educational for people.
Well, food security and agriculture is certainly one. Emergency shelter is obviously a very large one. It's a major concern and priority.
People need the roof above their heads.
Early recovery and livelihoods, ensuring that people are able to stand up on their own 2 feet and take responsibility for securing their livelihoods.
For example, cash for work.
And there's a variety of different modalities that we use to support that, absolutely, using cash as an inject. Around water, sanitation and health. Wash, exactly. Health generally, education, protection. We have a logistics cluster, which is really just dealing with the battle of ensuring that, you know, that initially the routes are open, that we bring together the various assets to ensure that relief is able to get from A to B. Major challenge.
The education cluster, for example, UNICEF providing tents for different schools. Well, most if not all the schools were damaged anyway. So that is one example.
Yes, exactly. Okay. There's a variety of different inputs, of course, when it comes to education, not only in terms of being able to reconstitute the safe spaces for learning. It takes some time to reconstruct those schools that have been damaged.
Right.
UNICEF are coming in with large tented areas, which enables those classes to start up again. And of course, all the learning materials necessary for classes to operate.
Okay, so Chris, this cluster approach is you have the UN and the OCHA, or the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs.
That's
on top
correct.
Of this.
Yes.
And it's not, all these groups are involved, are not all UN, no? So you have different NGOs, different international aid organizations.
Correct.
Coming together under certain clusters.
That's correct.
And then you just group them together and you all work together, you coordinate everything. So if there's one barangay that hasn't been serviced, that's where you send this particular group.
That's correct, yes.
That's how it
We've
works?
undertaken assessments, and of course very much in line and in keeping with the assessments that are undertaken at the national level. We cross-reference our data to ensure that we have a clear understanding amongst us all exactly where the critical needs are, and do our best to fill those gaps using the resources that we know that we have to hand.
Yeah.
And I must say, I think I mean, I've been involved in many emergencies. The most telling aspect of the response so far is the ability of the Philippine people themselves to take control and to respond to their needs. It really is quite remarkable and frankly inspiring what I've witnessed actually in the field.
Can you be more specific? What do you mean?
I'm saying communities who are able to having lost everything, take control of their own situation, to organize themselves, to organize the clearance, to recognize and understand what are the priorities within their community, that the school needs to be cleared themselves. They're not necessarily waiting for international assistance or any other assistance necessary. They're able to take responsibility themselves with the support of barangay captains as well as local mayors and administrations. But it really is extraordinary the extent to which communities are able to mobilize
Well, in a way,
themselves.
that is self-rescue, because we were told that don't expect rescue in the first 3 days, right? In the aftermath of a huge disaster like this, which is usually the case. When you come in, when UN comes in and OCHA comes in with all these different aid organizations, international aid organization, and local, you know, the local aid groups also work under that cluster, right?
Yep.
There's no one who works independent of it, right?
Of course there can be. But clearly that's not encouraged. In fact, it's actively discouraged. We do what we can to promote the understanding of the cluster system to ensure that we make best use of the resources that are coming in.
Yeah. Well, it's good that you can also coordinate very well with both the local and national government, so that they allow you to do your work. No, I mean, in other words, this is not all about ego or power or turf or territory.
No, far
right?
from it. Correct. Far from it. I think that this is something which we're very conscious of, and it becomes very apparent in an emergency. It's very humbling to work in this kind of work, environment, and particularly when you're become familiar and face to face with the suffering that people have endured. Absolutely, ego disappears.
Okay, so this cluster approach that we see in the immediate aftermath of Yolanda, a month, going on 2 months by January 8th, no? This is what we're going to see in the recovery phase also.
I think so.
Hopefully, because you were saying that this is what we...
Absolutely, and this is really the point, I think, that comes to really where the work that we've been doing feeds very nicely into the clusters that are established actually by national government. DSWD has been a very key interlocutor for us. And particularly, of course, within those social sectors. So many of the clusters marry and match with the national clusters, and that's something which we will endeavour to continue to support and to ensure that, come the exit of the internationals, that we're exiting in a way that is supportive of those national structures.
Before we go to a gap, we have to speak now to Deputy Director General Ramesh Subramaniam of the ADB. Sir, can you tell us what you thought or what you think of the RAY plan?
The RAY plan, Pia, is actually very good. this is the second meeting. I'll tell you why. This
Yeah.
is the second meeting that the government hosted today. The first meeting was about 3 weeks back, I think on the towards the end of November. Over this 3-week period, as Manny mentioned, I think about a team of 200 plus people coordinated by NEDA from various line agencies, donor partners have worked together in coming up with this. You mentioned earlier that the last 4 pages focus on how would reconstruction take place moving forward. In addition to what is there is a lot of background work that has been going on. And today, if in the Ray presentation, what was mentioned repeatedly is that Philippines is facing a situation of new normal. We haven't seen anything like this. The world has not seen anything like this. So clearly, this new normal needs to be tackled with new ways. The president, for instance, mentioned very clearly building back better is going to be a key priority. And what does building back better means? You asked earlier if needs are going to be larger. 8.2 billion is what the plan mentions. Now that is an estimate that is based on all the background assessments, whatever local governments, whatever line agencies have been giving. The plan is quite robust. It's quite self-contained in these various clusters or the sectors that the plan mentions. There are underlying assumptions behind all these estimates. And then now moving from the data, moving from the numbers into the rehabilitation and the reconstruction phase, certainly a lot needs to be done. For example, today in the morning, there was a lot of discussion on how to get livelihood support going. Many of the secretaries who were present were talking about the immediate challenges that the government will face. Number 2 was housing. What can be done? What does self-help housing mean? How can we get things moving quickly on the ground? And going back to this building back better, boosting resilience, because clearly Philippines is this year it's a 23rd typhoon. And obviously this is the mother of all typhoons. But clearly using all the lessons that have been learned, what can be done in the future. And as President Aquino mentioned, this is going to be a lesson not just for the Philippines. It's going to be a lesson for the region, for the world. So the plan, we believe, is actually quite comprehensive. It sets out all the parameters. It sets out certain basic guidelines. Yeah. Obviously, there is a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yes.
For instance, how to bring private sector, how to interact with civil society organizations, how to work with people, how to deal with disputes. There's a lot that needs to be fleshed out, but I think it's a fantastic start that we are off to.
Yeah. You said here in bullet points that you sent over before the show, coordination and implementation is going to be very, very critical, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is, as you had mentioned before, you've got first, if you start from the lowest level, you've got all the communities affected, and you've got the local governments of various tiers. Then if you come up, you've got regional or provinces and regional governments. When you're talking about rebuilding, you need to make sure that there is equity across the affected areas. And then you come up, you've got line agencies here at the national level. You've got oversight agencies, you've got DFA, DOF, which are looking at the fundraising efforts. And I think, over all of this, you've got lots of NGOs, lots of private sector organizations which are bringing resources. So all of these need to be very effectively coordinated. I used to live in Indonesia, in Aceh at the time of the disaster, visited Aceh many times. But this disaster is different. You go to the affected places, the damages are so spread out across a vast area. So reconstruction is going to be pretty challenging. So you need to connect all the various parties, particularly people, local governments, national agencies, private sector, bilateral, multilateral partners, to make sure that whatever common principles that we come up with can all be adhered in the reconstruction process. So coordination is extremely vital.
And that's going to be Ping Lacson's job.
That is what that is what we understand. But I think at the same time, these sorts of things are not the job of just one person or one team. All of us have to come together. I think the next 5 years are going to be game changer in the Philippines, with particularly local governments. Actually, Mr. Lacson himself today mentioned that the role of the local governments is going to be very critical. They need to be brought in. Line agencies are very critical. You know, even in Aceh, while the special agency called BRR, Gary mentioned Mr. Kuntoro, he was the chair of BRR. Now, BRR had to depend a lot on all the local governments, all the line agencies, all the other partners who were involved in the process.
Okay. The word is zero tolerance for corruption.
Absolutely. That's what we heard. It was very heartening to hear, and that's what you know, everyone likes to hear.
So that means Deputy Director General Esguerra and ASIC Domingo, no kickbacks, no substandard materials, as we are used to.
Well,
That smile is so telling.
well, I guess transparency very much is a byword of,
Yeah.
of Ray. And
Yeah, people aren't going to take any more of this.
absolutely.
They're going to lynch some people in public if they find out.
One of the elements of the government's actions is the FAITH, the Financial Assistance Transparency Hub, which was launched recently, spearheaded by the Department of Budget and Management. And again, all the government's efforts, you could click online. It's all you can find it all linked in the official Gazette. And the FAITH Hub will we are feeding actually our information on assistance we're getting from
Yeah.
overseas. And I
Okay.
think this will be a very important tool for transparency. That that again we are it's again it's like Ray, it's a work in progress, but we would like to put as much as possible of information on the assistance we're getting on the site, so people themselves can click and see where ultimately
Kasi ang
it's
sabi
going.
ni Presidente, every single dollar is spent.
Absolutely.
Down to the last cent. We'll have to take a short break. News.PH will be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're still watching News.PH on the Solar News Channel. I'm Pia Hontiveros. Our guests, Assistant Secretary Jesus Domingo of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Emmanuel Esguerra of NEDA, Chris Kay of the United Nations, and Ramesh Subramaniam of the Asian Development Bank. What are the other challenges, Chris, that you see down the road?
On top of the coordination challenge, really it's being able to maintain the momentum that we've started. There's a lot of very good work that is already taking place down in the affected areas. We've certainly, I think, got a very good groundswell of support, international support and funding coming in.
Yeah.
The challenge will, though, be able to ensuring that we're able to maintain the actual delivery of assistance to those people affected in the next coming months.
Yeah, well, maintaining the momentum, as you all know, the two of you are foreigners, as you all know, the Christmas season here is the longest in the world, so people are, and some of them in government, no, people are on vacation beginning this week and next week. So how are you going to, what can we do about that?
Well, that's not going to stop the assistance that is going into the region at all, or into those affected areas. We have good coverage throughout the Christmas period. People are working throughout. That is the commitment that we're making to address the needs. So certainly from the international community side, we're very much committed to see through this holiday period, however tough that might mean on our own families, but certainly our commitment is there to support those people who are affected.
Okay. Will the UN be here for the next few years while or at a certain time, at a certain point, are you going to be letting go and?
Well, of course. No, I mean we have
until the next disaster.
We have a relationship with the government of the Philippines, as Department of Foreign Affairs as well knows, and manages that.
Yeah.
So we have a longer term relationship. But I mean, in relation to this emergency, of course, there's a very significant thrust and additional support that is coming in, which will not continue for duration of until the immediate needs are addressed. And we've maintained within the plan that we've prepared in support of the RAY that we will continue for a period of 12 months, which, as I mentioned earlier, covers those first two phases that are outlined within the RAY document.
Okay. Some people were saying that when the next disaster strikes elsewhere in the world, then most of the international aid organizations will leave.
Well,
Which is really the case. Right?
Yes, well, I don't think that's strictly true. Obviously, we're taxed at the moment. These natural disasters are certainly coming more and more regularly. They're becoming larger and larger, and of course, they're taxing the international community more and more. I mean, the biggest challenge that has come onto the radar screen recently in terms of the support needed from the international community is in CAR. You've heard in the Central African Republic, and you've also heard recently just the enormous needs that are still unmet in Syria.
Right.
I mean, the demands for support for people who are affected by natural disasters, as well as those that are man-made, is really at an all-time high. So it's a very, very challenging environment within which we work. But our commitment is solid with regard to the support that we will be able to lend to the Philippines, and it's very evident that there is a considerable amount of public and government support that will enable us to provide that.
Mr. Subramaniam, what are the other challenges that you see?
I think, to take maybe two challenges, Pia. One is housing is going to be a major challenge, with about close to 1 million houses to be reconstructed, about half of them fully damaged. I think this is probably the largest disaster in recent times. Aceh was not this many. Haiti, I understand, was, Chris would know this better, was about a fifth in terms of the housing damage. So certainly, this is the case not just for the Philippines. Any disaster you take, damage to private assets always poses challenges. Public assets, public infrastructure can be rebuilt. Whatever standards you want to enforce could be, enforced. Housing is certainly going to be a challenge, and there are lots of models, lots of options that need to be looked at. We are talking about self-help type of housing, to give materials to people, to give them capacity, to give them training. But you can also go for, contractor-based type of approaches. You need a menu in this case, with about 1 million houses to be rebuilt. Related to that is this whole notion of building back better. Along with building back better, there has also been a phrase, building back differently and elsewhere. Now,
elsewhere.
Clearly with this, the new normal situation that was talked about this morning, and the national authorities as well as the local governments having adopted this 40-meter no-build zone area, certainly what that means is all the economic activity, all the people, all the livelihood need to be moved inland. All the local governments, we understand, I was in Tacloban and Ormoc, Palo and other areas last week, all the local governments have identified land sites to relocate these people. These are going to be permanent relocation sites. And obviously, when you're moving en masse people to these areas, you're talking about rebuilding entire societies back. Community planning is going to be very critical. It's not just putting houses there. You need to have water supply, you need to have electricity, you need to have roads, schools, hospitals, and all these other things. Or you need a network with these new communities interacting with other areas close by. So certainly these two things are going to be time consuming, will require a lot of resources, a lot of technical assistance. New standards were talked about this morning, both for public as well as private sector.
Yeah.
So we are looking at a minimum, say, 4 to 5 years for the rehab and the reconstruction phase.
Yes, Mr. Sgar.
Yeah, well, just to pick up on that point, what would make the situation of housing more challenging is the fact that alternative sites need to be identified, and that may not be an easy task, considering that the records, the titles have been destroyed as a result of the devastation, and so property rights issues would have to be dealt with in connection.
How will
with
you deal with that? When, for example, an LGU says, "Okay, let's use this piece of land," and then somebody says, "That's mine. That belongs to me." But I don't have the transfer certificate of title, for example,
Yeah, well,
to
so
prove it. To prove
so
my ownership.
these are some of the important functions that right now may not be too visible because we are busy with the physical side, but
Yeah.
that soft infrastructure is equally important because if they are not addressed very early in
Yes.
the recovery phase,
Oo.
they could hold back
Oo. But
future.
yes, but were you able to check
developments.
with the different LGUs all over, no, all over the devastated areas? For example, if you're talking about titles, you have to get them at the Land Registration Authority. Yung mga Land Registration Authority offices ba of the different LGUs, were they all destroyed? Or?
Well, that will have to be, checked. Different LGUs suffered differently in terms
Yeah.
of the impact. So it will be probably more difficult for those LGUs which suffered more severely. But
Yeah.
one of the approaches has been to identify government lands that may be available. For example, lands owned by government or foreclosed properties held by government financial institutions, to the extent that these are located in safe,
Safe
areas, are candidates for site development as alternative sites.
Okay. Yung mga, those no-build zones, the enforcement for that,
Yes, that's
Is
one of the
forthcoming.
very,
yes.
very critical challenges.
Because, in the first few weeks after the disaster, we had lots of video of people rebuilding their homes on top of their homes, of their old homes. And these were areas that were struck by the storm surge, right?
Well, it will take a good amount of political resolve to enforce that, as well as ensuring that the important aspects that have to do with the livelihood of people are present in the alternative sites. So jobs, schools, access to water, and all the other social services.
Yeah.
So it's really a convergence of the various efforts of government.
Okay. Well, speaking about political resolve, let's talk briefly about Philippine politics and how interesting it can rear its ugly head in times of a disaster or in the aftermath of a disaster. You had DILG Secretary Mar Rojas in that very interesting conversation with Mayor Alfred Romualdez. No? My question is, are we going to see anything like that in the recovery and the rebuilding phase?
We hope not.
You hope not. That's a very brief answer. How are we going to ensure that we won't see anything like that? Because I'm sure, for example, the UN, for them, there should be no politics here, right? Whether local or national, right? Nako, the silence is deafening.
I don't have a...
Asek Domingo,
Well, again, I think that
I'm sure you'll give me a diplomatic answer.
indeed. Well, again, the incident that you mentioned was just again in the immediate few hours after the crisis.
Day 4, day 5, yeah.
Yes. So again, I think the situation is much calmer, and I think there'll be much less passions on all sides as we all hunker down to the task of rehabilitation and reconstruction. So I think we're confident we won't see too much of that, if at all.
Chris or Ramesh, do you have a comment about that? How do we avoid things like that?
It comes back to the whole issue, I think, of transparency and an openness about what it is that needs to be done, recognizing the priorities, and making it clear what kind of resources are available in order to do certain things. Again, one of the striking things for me as an international responder to these types of events is the level of transparency that is already there. If you go to the mayor's office, to actually see in front of every mayor's office the contributions that have been received listed out and that can be tracked by every citizen who comes to the mayor's office is quite extraordinary. I've never seen that anywhere else in the world. And I think with that kind of spirit of openness, hopefully one can avoid any kind of misinterpretations as to why certain decisions are being made.
But when the UN or other international aid groups respond to a disaster, there is no politics involved, right? Because it is a humanitarian.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, we have those
concern.
humanitarian principles that are applied, and very much our response is based on a very fair and very standard assessment of need.
Ramesh, how do you?
Just to comment on that point, Pia, we are as you know, we are a development institution. But I think what we've seen so far is there is this overwhelming desire to reach out and to help. Now, the plan is an excellent first step. Clearly, the challenges in moving forward are recognized. It's not just in the Philippines. You can go to any country, you can go to any post-disaster environment. When you have so many players, so many actors involved, obviously there'll be different views, there'll be different approaches, and that is healthy because you will need solutions. You will need, certainly in this case, private sector actors need to come in. And then you will have people from different spectrums who have different views. What we have seen so far here, and this morning what was actually particularly heartening was the focus on outcomes, that we want to see very clear results. This outlines whatever 8.2 and the needs are about $12.9 billion. These need to be met and communities need to come back. And that is where the community's point is what we would like to look at very positively. If the affected people are brought into the reconstruction process, if they are consulted with, if local, call it grassroots or civil society organizations are empowered to make decisions, that will go a long way in making sure that there is reconciliation all around. We've seen this, take Aceh, take Pakistan, take any country, take Central Asia, even in Haiti, where we've had lots of problems. If you involve community level organizations, things do start looking better. You do need to build their own livelihoods. You need to build their confidence quickly. But once you are bringing them in, I think these differences can be certainly managed.
So differences in opinions can be managed and should not get in the way of targets that are set or outcomes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Clearly like for example, let's take housing. If you go to a certain area, you know what you have to do. Let's say you have to rebuild 2,000 houses back. Now, how do you do it? You may have different views. Go for self-help, or go for community-driven, or go for contractor-based type of approaches. As long as what is fundamentally important, we've seen this in disaster in, disaster out, if you ensure that there is equity in the distribution of resources. That's why out of the, I think if I remember the figure correctly, it's 180 billion pesos for housing in terms of needs. If the resources flow to all the affected communities in an equitable manner, there is full equity in distribution, there is fairness. Certainly those other differences will always be there. They're peripheral, they can be managed. We are positive. I mean, I'm not being positive just for the sake of being positive. It's a huge challenge. I think we all need to manage differences.
Yeah. So what we need to see, Lang, is that if there are differences in opinion, or people have different ways of approaching a certain problem, we shouldn't let that get in the way. Like for example, if person A will say one thing, person B says another, and then they don't agree, and then it gets to the point that, okay, let's not do it because we can't agree. We shouldn't allow something like that. That's what we're saying, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
I think there's enough incentive to get things done. The LGUs are just as interested in, getting back on their feet and restoring normalcy. So I think we can unite around that very specific
Well, it's just that,
objective.
I say that because it is a very common Filipino trait. Hindi ba? when people don't agree, okay, let's not agree, and then let's not do anything about it. It stops. It stops right there. So what we're saying here is that we're not just building back better. We're going to change as a people also.
I think we're building back better is not just building in the physical sense, but in a way also the institutions. We we hope will be also strengthened in the course of implementing this recovery program.
Much of the funding that will be needed will be coming from the private sector, right?
Much of what has been damaged
Yes,
has been
is also private sector, 90%.
sector, yes.
Yeah, but that's another tricky thing, right? When you put private sector and government together. Where do we stand in that regard, as of Domingo?
Well, this morning, while our way briefing was mainly for our friends in our development partners, governments represented by the embassies, and our international organization partners, much of the theme was examining how we can better engage the private sector. And there were some there were wonderful, I think, concrete ideas.
But they're very involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There were some interesting concrete ideas. For example, Secretary Purisima noted that it's not just about corporate social responsibility that only take you so far. It has to be about core business. And I think one of the concrete ideas that he had is, for example, let us call on our fast food giants to, for example, commit to sourcing at least 5% of their onions from the Yolanda affected areas. And I think another important theme was also insurance. There was discussion about really requiring local government units to have a mandatory disaster insurance scheme to be sourced from their calamity funds. So a lot of interesting and good ideas were generated this morning.
Okay, but the private sector had been so engaged from day one, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so it's not like, I mean, there is that cooperation already.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
private sector can be involved at various levels. What we've seen so far is private sector involvement in the relief phase. But as that phase tapers off, and what becomes important is the recovery, the restoration of business and economic activity, of investment in the area, is what the private sector does best. So the question is, how can government facilitate that? How can government attract private sector to come back to the area or to the areas affected, so that the business activity, commerce will resume and provide the much needed livelihood for the people there. So it's a matter of the government knowing what the private sector needs to be able to make that commitment to go back to the area. But the private sector will also want to see what the government's plans are to be able to decide, whether it's going to commit to that area. So it's in economics we call it a coordination problem, or a coordination game. You have to one party decides on the basis of what he or she expects the other party to decide, and that needs to be the transparency and the dialogue will ensure that coordination is going to take place.
Yes, Ramesh.
Yeah, just to come in on this point, because the role of the private sector is very, very critical, and this is actually, as Gary mentioned in the morning, I think at least 1/3 of the time was spent on talking about how private sector can be harnessed. We see at least 3 ways. Number one, as a contributor. If you look at whether national private sector entities or international private sector players, here you can look at individual contributors as well as corporate contributors, huge, from across the world, but from within the Philippines, there is a lot of interest. So contribution, number one. Number two is, again, going back to Gary, referring to Secretary Purisima, for instance, It's contributor, but also as an investor, as an enabler in terms of reviving economic activity in the affected areas. Now there, we need a lot of innovation. Private sector, you cannot get more innovative people than the private sector. What is it that the public sector, what is it that the government can do to provide that enabling role for the private sector to get investments back in the affected areas? Some of those areas actually did not have much of private sector investments. So using the crisis, the disaster as an opportunity, what can be done? That is number two. Number three is also very critical. That is the role of the private sector as an implementer. Because clearly you need a lot of engineering skills, you need a lot of logistic skills. Government
right?
has to do, but government cannot do it alone. So certainly you would need a lot of capacity from the private sector. So all these three phases or roles need to be supported. Some of it, financing obviously is very important in the initial phases, but as we move towards implementation, that role is going to be very critical as well.
Chris?
Yes, we've branched out and started to engage more and more with the private sector in the humanitarian world too, and not only as potential sources of direct funding, but very much in the form of partners. They've been extraordinarily supportive in terms of our work in just providing the mechanics that enable us to do our work, particularly with regard to logistics. And there's some global corporate partnerships that have evolved with the United Nations agencies with some of the kind of more international logistics companies that have enabled that to happen. Similarly with regard to telecommunications, it's the same sort of thing, in as much that you know that you need to communicate in the immediate aftermath and how to set up those communication systems, and it's going to be the private sector who's best able to do that. And we've developed those types of partnerships which have been very effective.
Okay. Last 5 minutes of the show. I want to tackle before we end government bureaucracy and red tape. Are we going to see a lot of that?
We'll certainly do our best to minimize it.
Yeah. Deputy Director General Esguerra?
Well, I think in a situation such as this, we're looking at the possibility of probably relaxing some of the procedures that normally apply in normal times, so that procurement will be easier and the flow of services can be facilitated.
Have you identified specific procedures that can be relaxed, processes, or none yet?
Well, our development partners, for example, have indicated things like getting or facilitating the entry of goods that are needed for the construction or the reconstruction phase. I think that's very important. For example, Secretary Singson this morning was mentioned that instead of because local suppliers may not be able to supply some of the goods that are needed for shelter, for example, we would need a good supply, for example, of GI sheets to make those temporary or permanent houses possible now. If we follow normal procedures for importing those, then that may take time and stall some of the operations. So probably that's just one example of.
Yeah. Asking Domingo, you're going to tell us how we can bring in the GI sheets?
Well, actually, in the immediate emergency phase, the first few days, we very much the spirit of working together and minimizing red tape very much permeated the government. For example, we established the one-stop shop with DFA, customs, immigration to facilitate the entry of external search and rescue, medical volunteers and personnel. So I think with that same spirit, and I think many of the guidelines we established could very much carry into the reconstruction phase.
Because the farther we went from day one, no, parang napapansin lang ng mga tao, people would notice that all of a sudden, the red tape would come back, no? Or the need, or there's two, red tape, and the other is the need to coordinate with so many different government agencies before you get something done. It's parang back to normal. You're saying that.
Well, I'm saying this, with the depth of this crisis, I think, and we're learning our lesson, we cannot stop this momentum, we cannot stop this thrust. We must continue trying to cut and slash red tape, absolutely.
You're saying that we're going to use our common sense.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, final words. Asik Domingo, you first.
Okay, so definitely we need to build back better, but not only build back better, since disasters, there's a whole cycle of this. We must also be better prepared and more resilient.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Esguerra of NEDA, final words?
Well, this is a plan that we hope will be implemented with a sense of urgency. And I think that with the assistance of our development partners, as well as the participation of the communities, local government units, we can pull through.
Okay. Chris Cave, the UN?
Yes, just to build on the momentum that we've already generated, both in terms of the delivery of assistance, which is now coming in and flowing through the affected communities, as well as actually in terms of the relationships and the partnerships that are forged with government in order that we can really make best use of the resources we have to hand.
Okay, and Ramesh Subramaniam of ADB?
2 points, Pia. One is speed with transparency. Given the scale of the disaster, you need to make sure you build back better, but build back faster also. But at the same time, you need transparency to make sure that all the resources are used properly, equitably, and so on. Second point, I just wanted to share with you, I saw in Ormoc, roofless and homeless, but not hopeless. So Ray certainly is very much a symbol of hope. We need to work together in achieving this.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to all our guests tonight. Asik Domingo, Dr. Esguerra, Chris Cave, the UN, and Ramesh Subramaniam of ADB. Thank you. Maraming salamat. And thank you for helping our country.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. I'm Pia Hontiveros. This is News.PH. See you again next Wednesday. Good night.